Hello, and welcome to Podcash, the portable professional development podcast from Cash. My name's Dawn, and I'm the editor at cashalumni.org.uk. This week's episode is one that we have recorded under lockdown, and we're getting a little bit better at it now, so the episode doesn't really need much more of an introduction to this. I'll let the speakers introduce themselves. Take it away, guys.
So I'm Louise Dalton and I'm a clinical psychologist, and I have worked in the NHS for over 20 years, but now I'm working as a member of the research team at the University of Oxford.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Rapa and I'm a senior postdoctoral researcher in the child and adolescent psychiatry team based at the University of Oxford.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. And they both sound like really exciting job titles. It sounds like you get to do some really interesting stuff. So what is it that you are sort of both involved in together? What is the project that you're working on at the same time?
So we're really excited that the Department of Psychiatry in Oxford has joined forces with the Palix Foundation. That's a private philanthropic organisation based in Alberta in Canada, to join forces to share the science of how children's brains develop and the impact that has on their lifelong physical and mental health. So the Brain Story is a whole suite of resources that have been developed in collaboration with the Centre on the Developing Child in Harvard and the Frameworks Institute in North America. And this is really putting together, I guess, a story about how children's brains develop from the antenatal period and then very, very rapidly in the first few weeks and months of life, but also looking kind of further ahead in terms of why that's so important, and also the importance of the kind of main caretakers who are looking after the child in terms of providing that environment that's nurturing and enriching to help the child fulfill their potential, but also develop good social and emotional regulation skills that will help them with their learning and later development. But also really putting the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together, I think, in terms of why the early years are so important, but also helping people understand how that translates to physical and mental health outcomes in adulthood. So there's quite a lot of ideas around kind of ACEs and the neuroscience underlying child development and the effects of toxic stress. But it's really a story that has been made accessible by using a series of metaphors to explain quite complex scientific concepts in a way that makes sense to everybody. So they've been put together as short animations to explain some of the key concepts, for example, around what as researchers we would call contingent responsiveness, but they've badged as serve and return, a bit like a tennis match in terms of that early interaction between an infant and their caretaker. Or things like executive function skills, so that's planning, short-term memory, inhibitory control, and that's been described as air traffic control at a busy airport. So again, there's a series of short animations. They're the kind of things that you can imagine playing on a screen in a GP's waiting area, and they're really kind of public health messages trying to help members of the general public understand what's important in terms of children's development and what they can do to support their children, whether it's their own children or other children kind of in their family, with those aspects of their development. But crucially, it's not just about the early years, it's also explaining the mechanisms by which that will have an impact on children as they grow up. And of course, we all have our own brain story, so thinking about our own experiences and how that impacts on us as adults.
That was really, really interesting. And it sounds like the stuff that you are looking at sort of covers an awful lot of stuff.
Yeah, so I suppose what the Brain Story does is it's explaining those absolutely key, crucial mechanisms that are operating and processes that are occurring from in utero to throughout the whole of your life. So just trying to package those into really easy to understand those complicated neural processes in a way that is relevant for everybody. So the reason why we were so excited about collaborating with the Palix Foundation is that absolutely fundamental that anyone who is officially in a professional capacity working with children understands this core story, because it's the reason so when you do go on through certain courses and learn more about different aspects, this is actually the core underpinnings of all of those processes like Louise described. So not only do we have these, you know, nice metaphors all packaged into an easy to understand way, for professionals there is a free online course as well, which I think would very much complement a lot of the amazing courses that Cash offers, because it just goes into a bit more detail, presented by basically the world leaders in psychiatry, psychology and neuroscience, in explaining that core story, but a much more fundamental experimental level.
One of the things I thought was really interesting is that, I know, Louise, you mentioned ACEs, and obviously that we know that's adverse childhood experiences, but Elizabeth, you said that one of the good things about the brain story is that it helps people to sort of work backwards and look at things that might have affected them earlier in their life.
In that way, it's a story for everybody, because whether we're working with children or whether we're working with adults or whether we're working with older adults, everybody has a brain story. And if we're working with children, undoubtedly we're working with their parents as well. So it really does give us an understanding of perhaps why people are responding in the way that they are, why they're acting in the way that they are, why they might be acting in a way that feels quite self-defeating, but actually it helps us to understand why somebody might be behaving in that way. And I think perhaps gives us more knowledge and potentially more compassion and insight into what the factors might be that mean that a family is struggling in a particular way, or an adult's struggling to manage their own life circumstances in a particular way. So I think that one of the most powerful aspects of the brain story is it also, in that terms of the brain story certification course, it pulls together all these different threads that we might have heard a little bit about ACEs, or we might have heard a little bit about childhood trauma, we might have heard a little bit about neuroscience, might know a tiny bit about addiction or mental health difficulties, and it really pulls all of those threads together so that we can understand how they fit together, and how that affects us in our lifelong journey. So I think for me, it's about really synthesizing that knowledge in a way that does make it easy to understand and helps us to put all those little components together rather than having sort of isolated bits of knowledge. It helps us kind of really pull it together and think, right, now I get it, now I understand how all these different factors impact and why they're important.
And what's really key, and the reason why the brain story really speaks to our work, which we've been doing for X number of years, is that it's very much non-stigmatizing and non-blaming. So I think there is a lot, especially in the media and the way people talk about certain groups of individuals that may be struggling to do certain things, that actually, instead of saying, oh, it's because they just can't get their stuff all together and they never make it on time for appointments, or they're always late, or the children never have the right equipment when they get to school. It's not about that. It's about trying to understand, you know, perhaps families that do struggle to get their children on time, instead of being derogatory or blaming them for just not being able to cope like the rest of us, to actually look at that family and think, you know what, you know, it's been very difficult for that mother or father or both to get their children to school on time, but you know what, they have got them there to school, they have managed to get them, and actually congratulate them for even getting there, because it is hard, and that's all to do with executive functioning, which we, you know, planning ahead and thinking about what's about to happen next. All those skills get learnt very, very early on in life, and then again during adolescence. You can develop them over time in adulthood, but it's really, really set in those early years. So understanding that as just a human being to another human being just makes everyone treat each other a little bit differently, and that's what's so powerful about that, and why we like it so much, because in psychiatry we're all thinking about, you know, why are we like the way we are, and people shouldn't be blamed or just chastised for not performing the same way as everybody else. So that's what's really important.
I'd never considered my own sort of background or my own childhood and how that had affected who I became and my reaction to things. So things that scare me that probably shouldn't scare us, like having meetings with important people who work for Oxford University and whether they think, you know, like all of those like sort of hang-ups that we all carry around with us all of the time. And it's only really been since I started to look at self-regulation and the stuff that is around for early years and speaking to practitioners about neuroscience and things that I realised that actually the way I react to some situations is probably not helpful for the situation itself, but that's because of the way that my brain's been wired and the sort of way that it happens, and it sort of helped me to take a step back and to think, oh, actually that's not him, it's me. And if I'd said it this way, or if I'd approached it differently, I would have gotten a different reaction. And sort of to play with how I respond to things a bit better. Do you think the brain story and people having a bit more of an understanding as to how their own brain has developed might be helpful for sort of practitioners looking to do reflection, or to sort of embed a bit more of that reflection into their practice?
I mean, certainly we all have our own brain story, and absolutely, I think the feedback from people, particularly in Canada, where the brain story has really, I guess, kind of been growing and evolving for quite a number of years now. The feedback from people who've completed the brain story certification course is very much that it's helped them understand more about themselves and about the impact of their own early experiences on how they are now as adults. I probably wouldn't say there's a huge amount of self-reflection within the brain story certification course. I think it's probably something that you might pick up as you go along.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what it does do, which is slightly different but uses the same word as self-reflection, is that once you know more about the core story, that you can actually reflect on how you can support families that you meet, and the core story is that your brains are built over time, and there is this amazing game which we would have loved to have played, and we could have done a really lovely video for you guys to have a look at, although there is some online called the brain architecture game. What happens is groups of 5 to 6 of you basically build a brain using pipe cleaners and straws. And you have dice and cards, and you're basically building a child's brain over the first 6 to 7 years of their life. So you can imagine a pipe cleaner isn't that great building material, and but once you put that pipe cleaner through a straw, it suddenly becomes a lot stronger, and therefore you can build your brain taller and stronger. And as things happen during this child's life, which you get dealt cards to tell you, so for instance domestic violence, or parents lose their jobs, you can imagine that if it's a brain that's got lots of straws and lots of pipe cleaners, that it will probably be stronger to resist that impact, compared to a brain that potentially is just built of pipe cleaners. So going back to the self-reflection, what that game does help you do as a practitioner, and this gets played by everybody from parents to practitioners and healthcare professionals and any professional, is that you look and you think, okay, how could I be a straw for the people I work with? And so in that way, the brain story does give you self-reflection, but in a slightly different way to what you were talking about. But it definitely does. Just, you can sit back and think, okay, I know this family, this is what's been going on with them. Is there something I can give them that would be a straw for them? Is it that I refer them to a counselling service? Is it that I am that straw? Is it that there's a teacher in that child's school that I should talk to and they could become a straw? So in that way, it does do self-reflection, but more in a professional practice sense.
Yeah, and I think that is what I've found helpful about some of the resources that I've looked at, and I think just having that knowledge as to this is how this works eventually does make you sort of go, oh, hang on, this week is Mental Health Awareness Week, but the theme of this year's Mental Health Awareness Week is kindness. Do you think that it's true that being kind is quite an important sort of positive way to just build bits of neurology for children, and help them to build their brain in a way that is going to be as strong as it can, and to face those challenges?
Absolutely. I mean, I think linking back to the brain architecture game that Elizabeth was just describing, actually about being kind both to ourselves and as well as to other people is crucially important in terms of that idea of being a straw. Actually, somebody who's working on reception simply by being kind, acknowledging that actually somebody might be late for their appointment and they might not quite have brought all the right paperwork with them, but actually they've managed to get there, potentially with several children in tow, actually is a huge achievement for some people because of their brain architecture, which makes those planning skills so difficult. Actually, the kindness of acknowledging the efforts that someone's gone to can make a huge difference to that person and really help someone to be a straw in potentially quite a difficult situation. So I think I would very much extend that analogy to say actually kindness is very much part of a straw. But also we need to, again, linking back to your earlier point about self-reflection, again about being kind to ourselves as well, and perhaps recognising that the impact that our own early experiences have had on our own brain development, and being kind to ourselves in terms of acknowledging why we might find particular situations difficult or challenging or harder than other people. So I would absolutely echo that kindness is crucial to our mental health, and also being kind to other people is also good for our own mental health as well.
Thanks. And I think that being kind to yourself piece is really important. I'm not very good at it, and I'm trying to get better at it. But I think in the current circumstances that people find themselves in, kindness is sometimes a little bit more difficult, especially to yourself. I think there's a lot of people feeling pressure to achieve a lot because they've been told that they've got lots of extra time. And children as well, you know, when you do have time because you're not at school or you're not doing these things, is there a danger in putting that sort of pressure on people, including children, in this sort of circumstance where, although we may be time rich, our brains have an awful lot to cope with anyway, because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in? Yeah,
so I guess one of the metaphors that the brain story uses is the resilience scale, in a very simplistic way to describe it, but there's a lovely animation on the website for people to have a look at. This is a scale where we've got negative events which are difficult, so toxic stress, that would be things happening in our environment, in our families, at school, which are making things more difficult on one side, and then on the other side of the scale we've got positive supports. So that would be the straws that we've talked about, but that would also be having supportive caregivers, supportive staff at school, in nursery, in the community. So again, really thinking about what we've got on both sides of the balance.
And I think what's really important is, although we're calling it a scale, it's a set of scales, as in weighing scales. And I think that's where people get confused, and people think of a scale as, say, 0 to 10. When we talk about the resilience scale, we are talking about the old-fashioned, how you would weigh out flour on one side and put a weight on the other. So when Louise is talking about positive events and negative events, then they are on either side of the scale, and ideally you would like to have your positive side up in the sky, because therefore you are feeling very resilient in that process. Or if there was lots of bad things happening, the pandemic being one of them, then that would push that back down, and then your more negative experiences and the way you're feeling would be tipping the scales the other way. So I think you're absolutely right. Louise and I do get very we get very frustrated when I think the word resilience gets bandied around far too much, like you say. And actually what we're talking about is that it's a very movable, it's not set in stone. It depends on what's going on in your life. It depends what positive supports you have. It depends a bit on how your genetics were involved right at the very beginning, but it's not just about genetics, it's about your experiences. So you're tipping the scales either way. So that's when we're talking about resilience, it's very much in a set of scales resilience, not a set 0 to 10 or 0 to 100 like a thermometer.
And just being aware at the moment that I think a lot of everybody's emotional and kind of physical energy is taken up with dealing with the current pandemic, which is going to be weighing down for everybody on the kind of the negative side in terms of those experiences. And so I think what we have to do is try and balance those out with more positives. We can't remove all of the stress about the current restrictions and the social distancing and so on, or the lack of routine and structure that's so important, particularly for children. But what we need to do is counterbalance those with positives. So in terms of, I guess, coming back to your question about the added pressure of all these things that we should be doing, I think generally shoulds and ought tos can be quite unhelpful for our mental health at the best of times. And I think we do need to acknowledge the impact that the general situation is having on all our resilience, really, how much kind of emotional space we've got to be coping, with being kind of, in close proximity to our nearest and dearest in the home. But actually, that's not something that most of us are used to. We're used to be going out a bit more. We're used to having, a wider social network and so on. And actually, it's about small things can feel much larger when you're all kind of enclosed in one space. So I think actually, for me, realistically, it's about recognizing that survival is okay. And actually, if we're all getting through this and still loving one another and still having good relationships at the end of it, I will absolutely take that as a win. And no, I haven't learned any new languages, and I haven't really got any fitter, and I haven't been doing anything new. It's also just about reducing that pressure on ourselves and acknowledging what we are doing well, and also how hard some of the small changes are to our daily life are for us emotionally and practically, rather than feeling that we've got lots and lots of shoulds and ought tos. That's probably not a terribly scientific answer to your question, but I think that's my kind of pragmatic answer to
I think it'll be a very reassuring answer to that question for a lot of people listening who are feeling that pressure to better themselves and to start their side hustle during this. I think
because the reality is that everyone doesn't have more time, and I do think that is coming through a bit more now in the media and how people are talking to each other, because in fact there's very few people that do have more time, unless you are furloughed, but even then you could have 2, 3 or even one child, and that still takes up all of your time. And I think what is really important, and something that's very important to Louise and I's work as well, which is all linked with the brain story and understanding, and going back to your question about kindness. So what is really important is that when we think about children in particular, that the conversations we're having with children are very honest and they are very authentic when it comes to emotional things. So what seems to be happening more and more is, and we know this is a lot of our other research within our groups that we do, is that people want to protect their children from any form of distress or upset, which is completely understandable. But actually in this pandemic, we need to be talking to our children more about, I think most children know what COVID is, they know it's a virus, but actually that it's difficult for all of us. So again, going to that, we all have our own brain story, we've all got our resilience is being pushed one way and the other, but actually as a family, whether that be a biological family or even just friends who are living in a house together, that you all share how hard this is and how emotionally difficult it is, and share those feelings with your children and your friends. And that is really reassuring for everybody, so nobody's pretending, and nobody is, especially with children, they can sometimes construct their own reality for what's going on, because nobody wants to upset them by saying, I talk to my children often by saying, this is really hard, I'm not very happy today either, I'd like to go and see my friends, and so it must be very difficult for you. And modelling that kind of conversation and that authenticity is absolutely crucial for psychological well-being in children and in adults. So I think, going back to your kindness thing, it's about acknowledging this is difficult. There are of course times when this is lovely, when we're all together and the sun's shining, but this isn't normal life, and everyone needs to acknowledge that and talk about it.
And I think absolutely I would agree with everything Elizabeth said, and I think also linking it back to one of the brain story metaphors is around the idea of serve and return, or contingent responsiveness. And actually that is very difficult when, as adults, we're preoccupied with the safety of perhaps older members of our family, or what's happening with our job.
Continue to explain this bit, could you tell us what either of those fancy terms you just used means?
Yeah. So serve and return is another way of describing contingent responsiveness. So what we're talking about there is the reciprocal relationship between an infant and somebody who's playing with them. So when the baby makes a sound, maybe smiles or gurgles or starts to babble, then the caregiver at that point responds back with their eye contact, echoing back, "Ooh, what's happening?" To somehow acknowledge and mark what the infant's doing, and then the infant knows that the person they're playing with has heard them and is seeing them, and so responds. Again, if we think about serving a tennis ball by the child making that initial approach to the adult with the sound or vocalization or smile, it's like throwing the tennis ball and hitting it over the net, and then the adult then picks it up and returns it. So that's the idea of serve and return, which is just an easier way of talking about contingent responsiveness. So if we're thinking about that, I guess, as a caretaker at that point, in order to return the child's serve, you need to be watching the ball, you need to be able to move around a bit, you need to be able to know when the child's served at you. That's much, much harder to do if you're preoccupied perhaps with the concerns about the health of an older member of your family, or about financial concerns, job security, or just the real practicalities of living when everyone's kind of locked down as we are at the moment. So again, it makes it much, much harder to be responsive in that serve and return tennis game when we're all worrying about the current pandemic. And that's why I would really echo what Elizabeth said, that it's so, so important that we're honest with children about what's happening, so that they don't start blaming themselves or think that it's something that they've done, or they don't see kind of this mysterious change in their adult's behaviour as a degree of threat, and then have no understanding of what that threat is. It's really about trying to explain it to children, and as Liz said, really modelling, this is how we talk about feelings, this is how we can share feelings, and actually the benefits of doing that. Because another area of research that we've been very involved with is very much around children who have a life-threatening condition themselves, or their parents have a life-threatening condition. And the research shows that actually parents are very good about talking about facts and explaining things in quite a sort of a medical or technical way, but find it much harder to share their own feelings about it. They want their children to share their feelings about what's going on, but don't provide a kind of an example or a model of how you might do that. And children really need us as adults to lead by example in terms of talking about our feelings, talking about how things are difficult, and then also saying, you know, when I'm feeling really sad or when I'm feeling really scared about things, this is what we could do, this is what I find helpful, so that children again can start to learn those skills for themselves. Oh, well, maybe I'll try that. Or if I talk to mum or dad and tell them how I'm feeling, they might help me think about what I can do in terms of those emotional regulation skills.
And that, of course, all adds to that positive supports on the resilience scale. So children will be more resilient on that scale if their parents are providing that model for them. So it all ties in, especially in this pandemic. The core story just provides another way of kind of explaining how this is affecting people, but also if we all deal with things with a certain level of understanding that actually this is not going to become a toxic stress event, if we're all talking about it and understanding these serve and return interactions, etc. So it's a nice way to try and frame it as well, I think.
That makes a lot more sense to me after you've both explained it. I definitely grew up in a household where I was encouraged to share, but modelling was very much pretend everything's okay and it will be. There are lots of people my age that grew up and sort of were shaped from their teens by virtual communication and social media, where the predominant theme is to present the life that you want rather than maybe reflecting the life that you've actually got. Do you think that has that same negative impact of reinforcing that we really shouldn't talk about the things that are worrying us or that make us sad or that are struggles, because really we should only be sharing the wins, because that's how you get ahead? Yeah,
I think that's one of the major challenges of social media, is that it enables us to curate the life that we want to present to other people. And nobody posts pictures of the fact that they're taking the bins out again, or I'm now wiping the floor up again, or all the very unglamorous, boring parts of my day. And absolutely, I think that can...
Yeah, we're definitely all sat in the tidiest parts of our houses right now. Yeah,
I haven't got my camera on, you have no idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we have to, when we're looking at social media, we have to maintain a kind of an awareness that actually people are presenting what they want us to see, and they're absolutely not presenting the really difficult bits.
Social media does a lot of good. I can't say so. For instance, good mental health or poor mental health is much more talked about now because of social media. I think social media plays an absolute crucial role in everybody's lives now, and it shouldn't be dismissed. But it's exactly right what you both are saying, in the fact that it can, if you are suffering from poor mental health, that social media can be quite damaging and can almost reinforce your anxiety or your depression in some way. But yes, we still believe that social media does play a crucial role and does a lot of good as well. But it has to, we all do it. We all look, Louise and I, always looking at our Twitter accounts and how, not our personal ones, but our work one. And that is really important to us. And we know that that's the way information gets out there. So we know that it plays a role. But yes, it's very hard if you are suffering from a mental health disorder to kind of disassociate what we're talking about of what we see is real and not real.
Things like the brain story, and actually just being able to understand how things impact on how the brain develops or how we make neural pathways and connections, might actually be a good way for people to be able to support their children with stuff like using the internet and social media and how to play with that and assess it, because they'll be able to look at maybe what impact that information or that time is having on children in their class or different things.
Parenting does play a crucial role. So yes, I suppose understanding what you do with your children as a parent begins that pathway and those neural connections of how to deal with social media or how to deal with negative feelings and emotions is definitely the role of a parent, or not just a parent, but anyone that comes into contact with a child. And I think that's what's really important for us as well, going back to what I was talking about at the beginning about stigma and blaming, is that actually everyone that comes in contact with a child in the community has a role to play in building a child's brain, which is very much the core story of the brain story.
So yeah, aunties are very, very important, Dawn, and actually one of the main messages from the brain story really is that it's around building our community and the role that we all play in communities to building not only our own children's brains but the brains of all the members of our community around us.
My sister's very upset that I'll only ever be an auntie because she feels like she's being robbed because she's made me an auntie and I get to do all of the nice things and she has to be a mum and I don't. But one of the things that you've both mentioned that I wanted to ask you about is that you've both mentioned the word resilience and the resilience scale. I think there's a lot of people who hear the word resilience a lot and they may have been told that they're not very resilient or that their children aren't very resilient, but for me there's a bit of a misunderstanding about what resilience is or what it means. The brain story sounds like, because of the way that it gives people an understanding of how the brain grows and how it works and sort of where things develop, that it'll help people to understand what resilience actually is and how we build resilience.
Yes, definitely. So the resilience scale that we've already mentioned, I talked about the negative events, so sort of toxic stress, difficult challenges that we have in life on one side of the scale, and then the positive supports on the other side. The key thing that I didn't mention earlier is the fulcrum, so that's essentially the balance point of the scale. And if you think about sliding that either to the left or the right, that makes a big difference in terms of, I guess, the power and influence that either the positive events or the negative events have on either side. And how we shift that fulcrum is around how we develop skills and abilities. So again, we're thinking about that scale. We can either ideally take away some of the negative toxic stress, or we can add more positive supports, or we can develop more skills and abilities to shift the fulcrum. which will then, as I say, in turn affect how those positive and negative events balance. So there's lots in the brain story that I guess talks to the idea of resilience, and very much that resilience is something which changes over time in response to what else is going on in our life, but also provides some very concrete ideas about actually what we need to do to try and improve our resilience. But I think it also explains at times why we might feel that our resilience is limited. Again, coming back to that idea at the moment, we've all got lots of, quite a lot of extra pressure, like downward pressure in terms of kind of the negative events of all the consequences of the COVID pandemic, which means that we need more positives on the other side to balance it out before we even start thinking about moving the fulcrum.
No, that's excellent, because I think that there are people who get quite anxious about resilience, and actually that if I know that I once talked to someone who had been given some feedback in a work one-to-one that they weren't very resilient, but they felt like that was a failing of theirs, so it's great that there are tools there to help people to sort of understand that and to really get what people are talking about when they talk about supporting children to become more resilient or grown-ups, any of those things.
And yeah, in those, your resilience isn't, that's it. If someone says, which isn't very helpful in a one-to-one, that they're not very resilient, well, that's it then. You're never going to be resilient. It's absolutely the opposite of that. Resilience is this movable, dynamic process and then that again takes the stigma and the shame or anything to do with, your poor friend thinking they're not very resilient. Well, that's fine. Maybe she wasn't for that 2-minute period during that one event, but it's not destined to be that forever.
And I think also, actually, it may be that she was being incredibly resilient, just that the person didn't have any understanding of how many negatives she was kind of dealing with at that particular time, how many negative experiences she was actually having to offset with the positives. And it was, remarkable that she hadn't, kind of completely gone under with, severe mental health difficulties at that point. She might have been incredibly resilient. It's just we need to know what's on the negative side of that set of scales.
That's amazing. I'm very conscious that I could talk to you both all day, but I did only book an hour into your calendars. Is there anything that you think is the sort of, what's the most important thing that you'd like people to take away from the conversation that we've had this morning, and just in general about the work that you do and Brain Story?
I think, say, the Brain Story is a story for everybody, that it's relevant whichever age group that you're working with. If you come across people in your life, then the Brain Story is relevant to you. And also just to really emphasise that there is a whole wealth of resources on the website, and they're all completely free. There's lots of downloadable videos and learning cards, as well as the in-depth certification course. So I think I'd really encourage people to take a look. It's very, very high quality resources. It's been put together by the big names in science, but it's also accessible to people as well. And most of all, it's free. I think people can't quite believe that it's free. And I think ideally we would love this to be knowledge that's held by everybody within the community, so that we've got a shared language, so we know what we're talking about in terms of serve and return or air traffic control or toxic stress. So that's a shared language between people working in very different specialties, very different professional groups, but also in terms of empowering everybody in the community to know why they might find particular things difficult, and to understand what their brain story is, so that as a community we can really think about actually how can we organise ourselves, how can we organise services so that we can really support our own brain development and the brain development of children in our community.
Thank you very much. You have mentioned that you have a work Twitter account. How can people find you both?
So our website is www.oxfordbrainstory.org, and we're tweeting regularly about all our different brain story activities at Ox Brain Story.
We really would love to hear from people, and we really would love to hear from other groups or even organisations on how we can help with disseminating the brain story resources.
You know, if people have got ideas about how the brain story might be relevant to the particular group that they're working with, or thoughts about implementing it within their organisation specifically, then we'd really love to hear from them. We're really really excited to hear from anybody who's thinking about how the brain story might be relevant to their work.
Thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been absolutely lovely to talk to you both.
Don't forget, if you've got some best practice or you'd like to share with us something great, you can get in touch with us at alumni@cash.org.uk. That's alumni, ALUMNI, @cash.org.uk, and we'd love to speak to you. You can find us at the Cash Alumni website at www.cashalumni.org.uk, or through the main Cash website for information about qualifications and other CPD at www.cachevecho.org.uk. Thanks very much, and until next time, take care.